5:59 a.m., Minnesota. Minutes before sunrise, unmarked vehicles settle into position around a cluster of ordinary buildings that had drawn little public attention. No sirens, no cameras, no speech to frame what is happening. The silence is intentional because investigators believe the real risk is not one shipment or one suspect, but a process that learned how to hide inside routine administration. In later briefings, officials described a case that begins with narcotics and ends with paperwork. Permits issued, exemptions granted, oversight delayed, and identities cleared through channels built to protect the public. The uncertainty is what makes it dangerous. If the allegations are even partly true, the problem is not only a criminal network, it is the possibility that ordinary systems, operated by ordinary people, can be turned into a corridor without anyone raising an alarm in time. The question is not only what was seized, it is who had the authority to make it possible, and how long that authority went unquestioned. Stay with me through the timeline. We will separate what is documented from what is alleged, and we will track how a local investigation became a national test of integrity inside public systems, with consequences that extend far beyond one city. For months, the public story sounded familiar. Overdose numbers were rising, city meetings were tense, residents demanded a response that felt visible and immediate. Leaders promised crackdowns. Community groups raised money for prevention. Grants and contracts moved quickly, because speed is often treated as a form of compassion when people are dying. In Washington, a harder line was also taking shape. One report claimed that President Donald Trump had signed a directive urging the Department of Defense to consider military options against drug cartels operating in Latin America. The details were disputed, and the language varied by source, but the signal was clear. The national mood was shifting toward forceful answers. Investigators say the Minnesota case sits inside that larger moment, yet it did not begin with a dramatic raid. It began with inconsistencies that kept repeating in systems that rarely aligned, licensing files that did not match federal records, work permits that appeared valid but could not be traced to real employers, addresses that surfaced in unrelated reports again and again across months. Officials later claimed that the first major indicator was scale. In their account, more than 1,150 individuals of Somali background, each flagged in federal systems for prior criminal records, entered the United States unlawfully and then resurfaced inside the same regional corridor. Investigators argue that a number like that implies coordination, a pipeline capable of moving people, generating documents, and placing them into jobs and housing without triggering the alarms designed to detect fraud. Officials also emphasize that allegations in this case focus on specific individuals and administrative channels, not on the broader Somali American community, which is diverse and overwhelmingly law-abiding. The next indicator was the commodity itself. In public statements tied to the wider probe, authorities said seizures included about 4.4 tons of fentanyl and heroin, with an estimated street value of more than $440 million. Even if those estimates are later revised, the implication remains serious. Seizures reflect what was found, not what moved. And officials repeatedly noted that the discovered volume can represent only a fraction of an active flow. Then the case shifted in a way that investigators say changed everything. The alleged facilitators were not limited to street-level intermediaries. The network, as described in briefings, depended on people who could open doors without forcing them. Supervisors who could soften enforcement, administrators who could approve vendors, and personnel holding federal licenses whose access looked ordinary on paper. That is where the story turns towards City Hall. According to officials, Mayor Mohammed Noor presented herself publicly as a leader confronting a crisis. She warned that overdose deaths had nearly quintupled. She stood beside law enforcement leadership and endorsed rehabilitation programs. Her public approval, in that same account, exceeded 68% at its peak. Investigators allege that the public profile created cover while a parallel structure took shape. By the end of 2023, they say internal directives approved by the mayor's office bypassed oversight steps that normally slow high-risk decisions. The result, in their telling, was the creation of 29 shell companies registered as logistics, sanitation, transportation, and consulting firms. On paper, the vendors looked ordinary. In the investigators' narrative, they functioned as connectors. entities that could hire, subcontract, transport, and move money with a city's seal nearby. The mechanism, as officials describe it, is the kind that can hide in plain sight. A vendor is approved, a contract is issued, a driver is hired through a subcontractor, a work authorization appears in a file, a lease is signed. Each step can look reasonable when viewed alone. Risk emerges when patterns align, when the same addresses recur, when the same exemptions appear, and when routine signatures begin to form a map. By early morning on the day of the operation, federal teams believed that map had tightened. Officials later said 129 violent offenders were already positioned across multiple locations tied to the network. Several sites were flagged as having unclear functions. Thermal imagery, they claimed, showed activity in buildings that should have been vacant. At 5:59 a.m., surveillance cameras captured a person leaving the rear of a building connected to the mayor's circle, carrying what investigators described as a secure data storage device. In the official account, the moment mattered less for what was carried than for what it represented. An approval trail linking routine decisions to an infrastructure built to move people, money, and narcotics. Minutes later, the operation began. By late afternoon, the images from the morning operation were already circulating, but case teams said the most consequential evidence was not on the street. It was in the paperwork that explained why certain doors stayed open. In the public narrative, the focus was enforcement, patrols, seizures, arrests. Inside the file, the focus was permission. According to officials, the alleged network depended on approvals that rarely make headlines. A vendor added to a list, a background check marked complete, a contract renewed on an emergency basis, a compliance review pushed into the next quarter. Investigators described the structure as layered. At the top were entities that looked civic-minded, nonprofit groups, community service contractors, and consulting firms with polished mission statements. Authorities allege that some of these groups functioned as pass-throughs, receiving money, hiring staff, and issuing invoices that made transfers look like routine programming. In that framing, the objective was stability. A stable platform can hire drivers, rent vehicles, pay subcontractors, and keep records that can withstand casual review. The pattern became clearer, officials said, when analysts mapped repeated identifiers across files that were supposed to be unrelated. A small set of addresses appeared across multiple registrations. A limited number of phone numbers were reused on different corporate forms. Several transportation and cleaning firms, created months apart, shared the same administrative contacts. None of those details proves wrongdoing by itself. Investigators argue that, taken together, the repetition suggests coordination rather than coincidence. This is also where the story intersects with immigration enforcement and where public debate often becomes less careful than the evidence. In briefings tied to the broader operation, federal officials said they were focusing on individuals believed to be in the country unlawfully and already flagged in federal systems. They also noted that Minneapolis and St. Paul sit near the largest Somali American population in the United States, and officials stressed that allegations focus on specific individuals, not a community. What investigators allege is procedural. They describe facilitators exploiting gaps in identity verification and employment documentation. Work authorizations were used to place individuals into legitimate jobs. Those jobs created pay stubs and addresses. The addresses supported additional paperwork. Over time, a person could appear established, even if the original entry or documentation was fraudulent. Officials say this is how a corridor becomes durable. It moves through routine compliance steps, not through a single dramatic breach. The case then widened beyond city contracting. According to authorities, some leads pointed toward travel and transport nodes outside municipal oversight. In one set of records summarized in public remarks, officials said more than 2,100 individuals were processed through an airport across an alleged 6-year period connected to the broader inquiry. Independent reviewers cannot evaluate that figure without the underlying data set. Yet the point investigators made was structural. Airports are designed to process volume, and that volume can conceal patterns unless auditors know exactly where to look. A separate allegation involved private security credentials. Investigators referenced 3 private aviation security firms and suggested that credentialed access, when abused, can reduce friction around movement and inspection. Officials did not describe a dramatic armed operation. They framed it as something more mundane and therefore harder to detect. Badges that look legitimate, forms that appear complete, and routine services used as a shield for logistics. By the time teams completed their first pass through seized devices and vendor files, they said they were no longer looking at separate problems. They were looking at one system with multiple outputs. People placed through documentation, money moved through contracts, and narcotics routed through transport links. The simmering tension from the morning raid shifted into a colder realization. If the allegations are accurate, the hardest part is not finding contraband. It is rebuilding confidence in the signature chain that made movement seem normal. Daylight came quickly after the first vehicles moved, and with it came the part of the operation most people recognize. Doors opened, handcuffs visible, names read aloud, and officers in marked jackets stepping into view. According to federal briefings, teams linked to immigration and customs enforcement, working alongside other agencies, detained 19 individuals near a shopping center in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. Officials said the location was chosen for control, not spectacle. It offered clear lines of sight, predictable foot traffic, and a way to limit a crowd from forming at a single doorway. The public heard a simple headline. Case teams described something more deliberate. The detentions, they said, were connected to finalized removal orders already recorded in federal systems, prior criminal records, and surveillance that had been building quietly while local leaders publicly maintained that the situation was contained. The tension was not only about who was taken in, it was about what the records implied. These were names that had been flagged earlier, yet remained present long enough for case teams to build a wider file. Officials also suggested the scale of the operation was designed to signal a shift. In some remarks, they referenced up to 100 federal agents deployed across the metro area. Even if that figure is later revised, it points to a central feature of modern enforcement. Volume is used to project certainty when public confidence has weakened. As the day progressed, the language around the case grew sharper. One senior official used unusually severe phrasing to describe the alleged offenders. The words traveled faster than the evidence, and they immediately shaped public debate. For families watching from nearby neighborhoods, the moment felt like a rupture. For supporters of aggressive enforcement, it looked like overdue action. For civil rights advocates, it raised concerns about proportionality and the risk of sweeping labels. Federal agencies responded by stressing that the operation targeted specific individuals with documented histories in federal databases, not a community as a whole. Operationally, authorities said the first phase moved on tight timing. In their account, the initial wave lasted about 14 minutes from the first approach to the moment the last transport vehicle left the primary site. That window matters because speed reduces the chance that phones can be wiped, devices removed, or records quietly transferred. It is also why much of the work begins after the scene is quiet, when evidence is cataloged and compared. By mid-morning, case teams said they were sorting what the operation produced. They referenced mobile phones, some linked to encrypted messaging services, along with notebooks holding overlapping contact lists. They also described business records that resembled routine operations. Invoices, payroll summaries, vendor agreements, and transport logs. The documents did not read like ideology. They read like administration. Reviewers then looked for a different category of proof. Signs of coordination rather than mere activity. Authorities pointed to repeated language across templates, the same addresses appearing in different corporate files, and sequences of transactions that appeared to move money in loops. None of those patterns alone proves a criminal enterprise. Officials argue that, taken together, they can suggest organization when paired with seizures and arrests, already described in broader summaries. This was also the point when the story widened beyond the morning visuals. In later statements, officials said they had indications that narcotics and financial flows were not moving as separate streams. They were moving as a single corridor, supported by contractors and intermediaries whose work looked legitimate, until analysts compared the full data set. The implication is uncomfortable but practical. Enforcement can remove people from the street, yet it does not automatically remove the permission structures that made movement seem normal. As evening approached, One question remained unresolved for the public. If these detentions were linked to records already sitting inside federal databases, why did it take so long for action to arrive? That question sets up the next turn in the timeline, where enforcement gives way to accountability, and where consequences fall not only on suspects, but on the institutions that processed the corridor for years without stopping it. 812A. M. Washington, District of Columbia. While the public was still replaying footage from Minnesota, a different phase of the case was already moving through federal channels. According to agency statements, officials began treating the situation less as a local enforcement surge and more as an integrity problem, one that could spread through procurement, nonprofit funding, and credentialing systems if left untouched. The logic was simple. If a corridor can hide inside routine approvals, then the fastest way to slow it down is to interrupt the approvals first. Within 6 hours of the initial operation, authorities said funding was suspended across 312 nonprofit organizations connected in some way to the emerging network, either through shared addresses, overlapping vendor relationships, or financial transfers that investigators considered unusual. The number itself is difficult to evaluate without a public list and clear criteria, and officials did not claim every organization was knowingly involved. They framed it as a containment step, designed to halt payments while auditors verified where money went and who authorized it. That decision had immediate human impact. Legitimate services can be entangled in broad freezes. Staff can be laid off overnight. Community programs can close before investigators finish reviewing files. Officials acknowledged the risk, yet argued that speed matters when financial systems may be actively exploited. For ordinary residents, the result was confusion layered on top of fear. Some people saw protection, others saw collateral damage. A second containment step focused on access. Investigators referenced private security credentials and specialized transport permissions, describing them as friction reducers. When access is granted, movement looks routine. When access is abused, it can make routine movement harder to audit. In response, federal reviewers said they began checking licensing records and contract histories across multiple jurisdictions, looking for the same repeating identifiers that surfaced in the Minnesota vendor files. Then came the timeline that turned enforcement into governance. Officials said analysts were given a 72-hour window to integrate seized devices, vendor documents, financial records, and travel-related data into a single map of relationships. In their account, the objective was not simply to name suspects. It was to identify the nodes where oversight failed, and the officials or intermediaries who may have enabled the corridor through routine approvals. By the end of that window, authorities said a federal integrity task force was formed to coordinate audits, referrals, and policy fixes across agencies. The message to the public was restraint and process. No sweeping claims. No single villain. A promise that the next phase would be about documentation, accountability, and repair. In the weeks that followed, the case moved into a phase that rarely captures attention. Audits, hearings, and the slow work of distinguishing what was merely connected from what was knowingly complicit. Officials signaled that some early actions, including funding suspensions, were precautionary rather than accusatory. That distinction matters. A broad freeze can stop abuse, yet it can also punish legitimate services that simply share a landlord, a vendor, or an administrative contact. For residents relying on meal programs, counseling services, or employment assistance, the loss can feel immediate, even when the long-term goal is protection. Investigators also warned that the most important lessons would not be found in dramatic footage. They would be found in process failures, emergency procurement that became routine, compliance checks that became assumptions, and fragmented databases that allowed the same names, addresses, or entities to move between jurisdictions without a full risk picture. Some reform proposals described in the aftermath were practical rather than ideological. Stronger verification standards for vendors, time limits on emergency contracts, independent review for high-risk approvals, better data sharing between city agencies and federal systems, with safeguards that protect privacy and due process. None of those steps guarantees prevention. They do, however, reduce the chance that a corridor can operate for years without being seen. For communities directly touched by the operation, the emotional outcome was uneven. Some people felt relief that the federal government was acting. Others felt targeted by the tone of public statements, even when agencies insisted the focus was narrow. In moments like this, confidence does not recover through rhetoric. It recovers through documentation, transparency, and a willingness to correct mistakes in public. The lasting question is the one the footage cannot answer. If a network can hide inside routine permissions, then what does accountability look like when the system itself helped it blend in?